It's the Opperman Report. And now, here is investigator Ed Opperman.
Okay, welcome to the Opperman Report. I'm your host, Private Investigator Ed Opperman. You can find me at Opperman Investigations and Digital Forensic Consulting if you email me at oppermaninvestigations@gmail.com. Our guest today is Jordan Chariton. Now, you could find him on his website is called statuscoup.com. On YouTube, he's got a YouTube channel. You can find him on Status Coup on YouTube. His Twitter is called Status Coup. And he's got this great new book. And we've been talking about Flint, Michigan since Reverend Pinckney 10 years ago. Reverend Pinckney came on the show, and they were saying, the water tastes funny over here in Benton Harbor, Michigan. But the book that just came out is called We the Poisoned, Exposing the Flint Water Crisis Cover-Up and the Poisoning of 100,000 Americans. And it just came out, too, as an audio book. Mr. Jordan Chariton, are you there?
Hey, thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for that. Before we get into your book here, We the Poisoned, tell us about your stuff. I know you do a lot of work here. Who is Jordan Chariton?
Trying to figure that out day by day, right?
It's the toughest question here.
Yeah, grew up on Long Island in suburbia, and went to college down in Florida, in Tampa. And when I was in Tampa, that was when I kind of got my first taste of the news industry, worked at the local Fox station there in Tampa. And then I kind of bounced around. I worked at Fox News right out of college, which was quite an experience. Then I went to MSNBC. And then I kind of just got sick of corporate mainstream media.
Yeah.
I realized it was kind of the same 2 or 3 stories, on a loop all day.
Yeah.
So I switched over, wrote for a few years, and then in 2016 kind of got my big break, started reporting on the ground, covering the 2016 election. And during that year, that's when I first went to Flint. I kind of went there when all the cameras had left and, the media had already done their 5 minutes of coverage. So when I first started covering it, it had already kind of been abandoned by the rest of the media. And,
right.
Yeah, I just realized right then and there that this is, in my career, the biggest story I had ever seen. And it was very different from how the media had reported it. So 8 years later and 21 trips to Flint later, that's kind of the origins of this book.
It's funny. So many of my shows start with the same question, and we even talked about it off the air. Tell us the official story, and then tell us what really happened. Okay, so what is the official story on Flint, and then tell us what really is going on down there?
Yeah, basically the way that this has been reported, and again, it's not been covered much in recent years, was this was a tragic mistake. This was, an error by government officials who were trying to cut corners and, save money by using the local river. It's actually the opposite. This was a for-profit. This was an effort to make money by government officials, private players, banks. It was a massive privatization scheme. And, the media really never reported what the real dark underbelly of this was. Essentially an effort to privatize the water system in Michigan, which, whether intentionally or just recklessly, used the poor majority black residents of Flint as the sacrificial lambs. So this was a massive financial scam that led to the poisoning of Flint. And at the end of the day, it's 10 years later, a massive cover-up that is actually ongoing, the cover-up.
I mentioned in my little intro there, Reverend Ed Pinckney from Benton Harbor, Michigan, who was an activist pastor down there, right? And he was telling us in Benton Harbor that they were in bankruptcy. The city was in bankruptcy. And the water bills were really crazy high. And what they were doing was they would turn off people's water. They couldn't pay their water bill. He actually had the tool. He would go to people's houses and turn the water back on for them. He had that water company tool. But the thing is, and then when the people didn't have water, they could condemn and repossess their houses. Did you cover any of that in this book?
Oh yeah, in a twisted, just dark and demented thing. Years after the poisoning of Flint, residents started getting notices in the mail from the city that tax liens were going to be placed on their homes if they didn't pay for their poisoned water. So basically, residents were having their homes threatened because they were behind on the water bill for water that they still couldn't safely drink or bathe in. So, there's been water. I mean, obviously, there's been water shutoffs, in Detroit, Flint, other cities. But in Flint, it was a little darker and more messed up because the water was not safe and is not safe. That people should know, because I think this has been kind of whitewashed and buried. And, the media just reports what the EPA says. But 10 years later, the water is not safe. It's still toxic. The testing they do is very, very selective and cherry-picked. I was just there in Flint for my book, and residents are still, 10 years later, coming up to me, showing me rashes on their skin, telling me their hair's still coming out in the shower, falling out in the shower. Residents still post to this day brown water coming out of their taps. It's not as bad as it was, 8 years ago, but it's still throughout the city. There's contamination of the water, which, common sense, 10 years later, they have not fully replaced all the damaged infrastructure. They haven't replaced all the destroyed pipes. So it doesn't really matter if the original source where the water is coming from is clean. If the water is going through corroded pipes, you're still going to have lead and other things leaching off.
Right. I'm dying to ask you this because, 10 years later, it's not the chronological order of the story here. But 10 years later, what about the Army Corps of Engineers? We don't have the resources to go in there and change all this plumbing?
We do, but we have a federal and state government that has so much bureaucracy and red tape. A lot of people don't realize this, but Flint was not declared a federal disaster. It was declared a state of emergency. And the difference is, if you declare a federal disaster, which hurricanes, you routinely get disaster declarations, tornadoes, the federal government could take over. So essentially, you could send in the Army Corps of Engineers, FEMA, and the heavy lifting to rebuild. But because of it's a little in the weeds, but there's a law called the Stafford Act. Republicans pushed for it, states' rights. They didn't want the federal government coming in to take things over. So the Stafford Act basically says that only for natural, air quote, natural disasters can you issue a disaster declaration. I think the federal government could have issued a disaster in Flint. It doesn't matter whether it was natural or not. It was a massive disaster. People died and are dying. And it's a massive infrastructure problem. But President Obama did not issue a disaster declaration, and therefore the Army Corps didn't go in, FEMA didn't go in, and it was left to the state of Michigan, the very state that presided over the poisoning and cover-up of this whole thing, to basically provide the relief. And Congress passed a bill for $170 million to Flint, but as shown in my book, very little of that money actually went to Flint Water. A lot of it went to special interest and, all the rest. So the bottom line is the Army Corps never went in. FEMA never went in. This could have been fixed. The infrastructure could have been replaced basically in a year for the amount of money that we snap our fingers in the morning and send to other countries. But it was not.
Okay. I noticed the book has a foreword by Erin Brockovich. Okay. And once again, the book is called We the Poison, Exposing the Flint Water Crisis Cover-Up and the Poisoning of 100,000 Americans. And great ratings. It's 4.9 star ratings. I recommend everybody to run out and get this book. So, okay, the cavalry never came. The federal government never came in to do anything. But what about civil lawsuits?
Yeah, I mean, that's really the most frustrating part of this because, for context, in 2015, 2016, when this first became a national and international scandal, the new mayor of Flint at the time, Karen Weaver, when asked, she put the number that negotiations should start at at $1.5 billion that the residents were owed. And immediately, the details are in my book, she got a call from then Governor Snyder's right-hand man telling her, you need to take that back. That's too much. So really what the residents of Flint, to replace all the infrastructure in Flint, the busted pipes, it would take a few $1 billion, which is nothing compared to the amount of money the federal government routinely spends everywhere else.
Yeah.
But years ago, there was a settlement from the state of Michigan with the residents of Flint for $600 million. Now, that might sound on paper like a good amount, but you got to take $200 million off the top that goes to lawyers. So that's $400 million. I've spoken with experts. When it's all said and done, Flint residents per household might get enough money like to get a used car, which is not enough if you have cancer as a result of this water, if your kids have learning disabilities as a result of this water, special education needs, if your home plumbing has been destroyed. It's crumbs. They were awarded crumbs compared to the magnitude of the problem. And that's only, by the way, the state of Michigan. 10 years later, the EPA, which was part of this cover-up, has not acknowledged guilt, much less settled. So that's Obama's EPA, Trump's EPA, and now Biden's EPA has not admitted guilt for their role, nor settled a lawsuit. So Flint not only got, in my view, crumbs from the state of Michigan, and that was Democratic Governor Gretchen Whitmer and Democratic Attorney General Dana Netzel, who presided over that civil settlement, but they also have not gotten a settlement from the EPA. And there's also engineering firms that were involved in this that have also not settled. So we're talking 10 years later, the people were given really the amount of money for a used car, and they still haven't been paid out yet for that insufficient amount. So it's really just a massive bowl of injustice all around.
Yeah, I'm really getting upset by this whole interview. $400 million for a city is insane, and like you said, with those class action lawsuits, man, all that money gets eaten up. Not just the legal fees and the lawyers, but they're cut, but expenses and all this nonsense that they put in there too as well. Let's go back, okay, to the beginning. Because you said that, hey, the motivation for this wasn't incompetence. Let's follow the money. Who's behind all this?
Yeah, in the book, I would say the first 5 or 6 chapters are the road to the water switch.
Yeah.
This really a decade period was not covered in the media. The media just starts with the water switch, but essentially, Flint had gotten its water from the city of Detroit, dating back to the 1960s. And the water was from Lake Huron, which is part of the Great Lakes. If your audience doesn't know, the Great Lakes in Michigan and surrounding states, some of the cleanest most glacial water on Earth. It actually provides 20% of the world's surface fresh water. So right in Flint's backyard.
They got the best water in town.
Right. So the city of Detroit, pumped the water out of the lake, treated the water at their plant, and then sent it through a water pipe to Flint. But there had been local officials on the ground in Flint, in Genesee County, which is Flint is part of Genesee County, for a long time were complaining that Detroit was price gouging Flint. They kept jacking up the rates for water, which, was a legitimate complaint. So they started the engines and let's just create our own water system. They called it a regional water system. But for all intents and purposes, it was an effort to privatize the water system because Detroit's system was a public system. So 2010, 2011, enter Governor Rick Snyder, who ran for governor of Michigan. He was a millionaire computer executive. He ran on, quote, running government like a business. And, we know how that works out. So he comes in, he waves a wand, he declares a financial emergency in Flint and other cities in Michigan, and he appoints unelected emergency managers to take power over the elected mayor and city council. So essentially a power grab. So right now in America, all you hear is democracy is on the line in the election. Well, democracy was actually canceled here. They put in these emergency managers, and basically the first order of business was, let's try and privatize the water system. So they came up with basically, and in engineering terms, it's kind of unheard of to build a identical pipeline going the same exact path and route as the existing pipeline from Detroit to Flint, water coming out of the same source, Lake Huron, and this water would be raw water. So the water Flint had been getting from Detroit was already treated water. But this new pipeline was going to be delivering raw water. Well, what do you need a lot of raw water for? Fracking. The governor was fracking all over Michigan. You need a lot of raw water for agriculture, the auto industry, meat packing. Basically, business needs a lot of raw water for their purposes. They were not hiding the purpose of this pipeline. They were calling it the blue economy because water was a cash cow, and all these businesses were going to get cheaper water from this new water system. But the politicians were selling it as this is going to save Flint money. Well, at the last minute, the city of Detroit, who did not want to lose Flint as a water customer, the city of Detroit offered Flint a 48% discount. So basically almost like a half-off discount, basically, which if you go to the mall, that's a pretty great sale. So the city of Flint would have actually saved money just doing nothing and continuing to get water from Detroit. But this was not ever about saving Flint money. It was about building an unnecessary new water system that was going to make a lot of people wealthy, and that's where we get to the financial scam. At this time, we're talking 2013, 2014, so about 10 years ago, the city of Flint was nearly bankrupt. It could not borrow. Legally, it had no credit rating. It couldn't borrow any more money. But to build this new water system, this new water pipeline, which was going to cost nearly $300 million, they needed the city of Flint to help fund it. They were about $100 million short in funding it. So how do you get a broke city who's not legally allowed to borrow any more money? How do you get them $100 million? The local officials, including the unelected emergency manager, they created a fake emergency that would allow the city of Flint to borrow $100 million. It was kind of a stupid, like there was a lime sludge pit next to the water plant. You know, the environmental department has said you need to clean this up for like a decade, but it was never emergency or urgent. But basically, they cited that cleanup as a, quote, emergency, and through the back door in the contract for that cleanup, they snuck in Flint being able to issue $100 million in bonds. And who funded the bonds? J.P. Morgan and Wells Fargo. So that's where Wall Street comes into this scam. So big Wall Street banks fronted the money. They issued the bonds for a broke, nearly bankrupt city to borrow nearly $100 million for a completely unnecessary new water system. And while that new water system was being built, it was going to take about 2 years, the local officials and the emergency manager said they could have just kept getting the water from Detroit, but to, quote, save money, we'll just use the polluted Flint River. Now, if you lived in Flint, I mean, people were horrified at the thought of using the Flint River for drinking water. General Motors had dumped their waste in there for 100 years. DuPont, Dow Chemical, I mean, it was known as a dumping ground. So they were going to use the Flint River, and they were going to use the Flint Water Plant, which I compare it to these Boeing planes that are falling apart midair.
Right.
The Flint Water Plant didn't even have the necessary equipment to treat the water, and we know what happened. The rest is history. They used a polluted river, a deficient plant. They didn't add the proper chemicals. They couldn't add the proper chemicals because they didn't even have the proper equipment. And my book, in very alarming detail, I mean, this was not an accident. There were blinking red light stop signs to stop. Workers at the plant were screaming, I mean, I can't curse, but some choice words. We're talking 6 months to a year before the water switch, telling the bosses, we cannot do this, we're not ready, we don't have the staff, we don't have the equipment. But, again, they had to meet the deadline for construction of this new water system. So basically, this was all about a balance sheet, banks making money, politicians making money, landowners making money, and the health and safety of the residents was really never considered.
Now you said it took them 2 years to build this system. How can they justify that? Hey, when we want to make money, we could do it in 2 years, but it takes 10 years to repair the system. If they could build it in 2 years, why does it take 10 years to rebuild it?
Well, one of those is a for-profit venture.
Oh, gotcha.
So there's incentive to build it quicker, and the other one is just, frankly, a bunch of poor folks, majority black city, and we'll take our time. And that goes back to what we discussed earlier. This could have been declared a disaster. Right. When the federal government wants to do something, they always find a loophole to do it. So they could have said, you know what, technically this is not a natural disaster, but this is the biggest environmental catastrophe possibly in U.S. history, and we're going to issue a disaster declaration. And if people want to sue us in court, I'm talking about Obama at that point, let them. But they didn't. So all the pipes could have been dug out in Flint very quickly. Within a year. And by the way, there were union plumbers in Flint offering to do it, at a very significant discount. And they said we could do it in a year. But in my view, I think the federal government does not want to set a precedent that it could actually do big things and help people. Because let's say they did that for Flint. Well, when there's the next environmental calamity, they're going to have to do it for everywhere else. And if your audience hasn't noticed, there's a lot of environmental calamities going around in America right now. So there is no legitimate reason why they could not have replaced all the pipes. There's certainly these folks in Flint are entitled to free health care for life. They have not gotten that. I talk to residents all the time who are basically going bankrupt trying to pay for specialists. Because if you have heavy metal poisoning from lead and other things that were in that water, there was bacteria in that water. Your regular small town doctor is not equipped to really treat you. You need specialists. You need environmental doctors. Most insurance won't cover that. And the residents of Flint, they only got a short-term Medicaid expansion. And that was only for ages 21 and under. So the adults were always left out. And that Medicaid expansion ended years ago. So really, if your audience doesn't know, lead is like a human wrecking ball through your body. It affects almost all of your, systems in your body, your brain. There are very few people that will go undamaged by lead. And then you add in the bacteria that was in that water. You add in PFAS, which are those forever chemicals that are being found all over the country. So it wasn't just lead. And that's another thing. Why weren't these people given, free health care, lifetime testing? So I call this what it is. This is a sacrifice zone. And the government has been in on it. And frankly, the media has done a horrible job. The media has just kind of painted this as some tragedy in the past that's now in recovery. And I'm here to tell you it's not in recovery. This is still an active disaster.
It's like that train wreck in East Palestine. When I've had those guests on here, they're still suffering to this day. And I got to go to that company and beg them for little handouts every week. And they pretty much went in there and bought up the whole town, that train company. And people who don't know...
It's funny you say that because I've been covering that.
Yeah.
And literally the playbook that they used in Flint to cover this up is the exact same playbook they're using there.
That makes sense, But for the audience that doesn't know, the youngsters out there, the 38-year-olds like yourself, right? I grew up in the Bronx, 62 years old, and when I was a little kid, they started putting those commercials on TV. Hey, don't eat the paint chips because they're lead paint. But let me tell you something. Even in the Bronx, South Bronx, the poorest neighborhood in New York, okay, there was a massive retooling. They removed radiators out of the schools and all kinds of stuff to replace all that stuff that was covered in lead paint. So it's not like it can't be done. They had the money in the Bronx back in 1970, or 1965. Why can't we do it now? It's just what a heartbreaking story this is.
Yeah. I mean, they can. That's the simple answer. I mean, I don't want to get too political because obviously people have different opinions, but I mean, we certainly have a lot of money for war.
Yeah.
We certainly have a lot of money to provide other countries with money to defend themselves, money. We got military bases all around the world. Yet we're constantly, the media is constantly asking politicians, well, how are you going to pay for, health care, education, remedying the poisoning of an American city? So it seems like our priorities are a little backwards because, I think a lot of people wrongly believe that, well, the federal government only has so much money. Well, I mean, look at the Afghanistan war. That went on for 20 years. The Washington Post did a great investigation finding that the generals were ordered by Washington, D.C. to spend $300 million a day. Let me repeat. They were told, spend $300 million a day, doesn't matter on what. So that was a 20-year war. You do the math. So we certainly have the money for these things, but at the end of the day, do you think, if this happened in Ann Arbor, Michigan, which is an hour away from Flint, it's wealthier and whiter, pretty sure if this happened there, and I don't think it ever would have happened there, I'm pretty sure there would have been a mass mobilization to replace all the infrastructure, probably put most of the residents in hotels while that was going on.
Right.
So this is an issue of, some people say it's race. It's not just race, it's class.
Yeah.
Because if you look at what's going on in East Palestine, different circumstance, but at the end of the day, people are poisoned, just like they were in Flint. Those folks in East Palestine are poor white people. It's a poor area. These folks in Flint were poor black people. The common denominator, they're poor.
Yeah.
So, of course, a lot of these things tend to happen more in black, brown, indigenous areas, but even poor white areas are now being made sacrifice zones. So, when people ask me what should people take away from this, I always say, this is not just about Flint. It might have happened in Flint, but trust me, the people of Flint didn't think this could happen to them. A lot of people don't think like mass shootings will happen in their town. This could happen to you. It might not be water where you are. It could be air. It could be soil. It could be fracking. I mean, in Georgia right now, there's a massive chemical plant that went on fire, and there's been contamination for over a week. So if you are in the wrong zip code, maybe you have the wrong skin color or you have not enough in your bank account, the government is not going to protect you. I am sorry to tell you, the government is going to pretend that they're doing a lot to remedy the situation, but in reality, they're not.
Yeah, they're going to protect the capitalist interest, which...
Correct.
Let me get back to this. Jordan Chariton, how do you deal with this? Do you have like PTSD from dealing with this kind of stuff? Because you're there on the ground in Flint, you're there on the ground in East Palestine. How do you, when you're seeing this tragedy firsthand before your eyes, how do you deal with it?
Whiskey and antidepressants.
Yeah, I know, man.
Honestly, I have a great wife, got a beautiful daughter, and I try my best. It's not easy because, I have people contacting me all the time.
Yeah.
From Flint, from East Palestine, from other communities. And, one of my weaknesses is I have a hard time saying no. I want to cover all of it, and I want to help as many people as possible. But I try my best, just to get away from it from time to time, watch a mind-numbing Netflix show, just take a walk, get away from it all, because you have to. I mean, you can't, as a journalist or an activist, you cannot be submerged in this stuff 24/7, or it will drive you crazy. But when I'm out there in Flint, and I've been there 21 times, I'm not gonna lie, it's very depressing.
Yeah.
It's a mix of kind of depression mixed with anger. I can't tell you how many times I've been in Flint or other places, and you're covering these kind of disasters, and then I'll go back to the hotel, you'll turn on CNN, and they're covering Trump's tweets or something ridiculous. And it's just that alternate reality between the suffering and corruption going on the ground and what the mainstream media is covering. It's pretty striking.
Have you ever heard of a book called Moral Courage?
Yes.
You have? Okay. Is that incredible?
I haven't read it. I've heard of it.
Well, I'm going to send you a link, okay, to pick one up. And I'll tell you something. It talks about these reporters around the world who, like Mr. Jordan Chariton, okay, they're out there putting their butt on the line, for some kind of crazy, I don't know, not crazy, but you know what I mean, some kind of moral integrity. And I'm telling you, bro, you look at the pictures of the faces of those reporters in that book. The photography is incredible. You'll see the same face you see when you look in the mirror in the morning. I encourage you to get that book.
Yeah, I will.
Now, you mentioned early on that the issue here was that the water company was privatized. What is the name of that private company? And who's the CEO?
Oh, this is my possibly the most corrupt part of this, but there's a lot of corrupt parts of this. So essentially, your audience might not know, but most towns and cities have some type of water commissioner in a different title in different places. So in the Flint area, there's a guy by the name of Jeff Wright, and he's the drain commissioner. So that's an elected position, and basically your job is to control the water in the county and the city, and, provide clean, safe, affordable water. This guy who was the elected drain commissioner, so that's obviously a public government position, he was also the CEO of this new water system called the Carragandi Water Authority. So it's a blatant conflict of interest. He was essentially the elected government official for water in this Flint area, while also serving as the CEO of a privatized water company. Now, he'll say it's not a privatized water company, it's a public authority, but all intents and purposes, it's a privatized system. And his motivation was to make money, to build a new water system that could make more money for the county, Genesee County, which Flint is part of, for investors who were going to buy the bonds for this pipeline, for the Wall Street banks who were going to issue the bonds, for landowners who mysteriously purchased land along the route of this new water system. So essentially, you had this guy. You always hear public-private partnerships, which is just a code word for privatization. This guy was literally the public drain commissioner, while also the private CEO of this privatized company, and he just happened to have gotten a ton of donations for his campaigns from the contractors that he awarded contracts to build the pipeline. So he was getting massive campaign donations based on the no-bid contracts he gave out to basically his pals, his contracting friends, engineering firms. So it was all just a scam, fraudulent. And based on my reporting, part of the cover-up is, so there was an investigation that launched in 2016 into Flint. A special prosecutor was appointed outside of the Michigan Attorney General's office, and they charged 15 state and city officials from 2016 to 2018, including the head of the health department. They charged him with involuntary manslaughter. They charged some of those emergency managers, those unelected emergency managers, with basically financial fraud related to that fraudulent financial deal I told you about. So based on my reporting, they were looking into that fella I just told you about. Based on my reporting, they were building a case against several officials, a racketeering case known as RICO. And if your audience doesn't know, RICO was created in the 1970s to go after organized crime like the mafia. It usually involves bribery, kickbacks, extortion, financial crimes. So they were very close to filing a massive RICO case based on the financial fraud that caused all of this. They were also, based on my reporting, and this is all in the book, they were building a case against the Republican governor of Michigan for involuntary manslaughter for his role in the cover-up. But the current Democratic Attorney General, when she got into office in 2019, she fired all them. She started the investigation from scratch for no real reason, and she dropped all of their charges. She claimed they were incompetent, which, based on my reporting, is not true. She then, a year and a half later, her office recharged a lot of the same officials she dropped charges against with lesser crimes, including she charged the governor of Michigan with a misdemeanor when the people she fired were building a case against him for involuntary manslaughter. So based on my reporting, the people she fired were actually doing a thorough investigation. They were close to a massive case on a RICO case. They were building a case against the governor for involuntary manslaughter. And for reasons I could go into, I believe the Attorney General sabotaged the investigation for much darker reasons.
Well, Mr. Chariton, I'm sure the Department of Justice rushed into to superseding indictments on all these folks, right?
Wouldn't that,
You'll laugh at me, bro.
Wouldn't that be a great world? No, we only, yeah. Actually, based on my reporting, the original investigation, they actually brought it to the FBI because they wanted the federal government to get involved because the financial fraud was so significant, and for political reasons, the FBI didn't want to touch it. But nope, the DOJ hasn't gotten involved, and to add insult to injury for the poison people of Flint, basically, after the current Attorney General, her name's Dana Nessel, sabotaged the investigation, the Michigan Supreme Court, in a 6-0 decision, so it was not just conservative judges, it was all the judges, they threw out her charges because they said that she and her office brought the indictments they brought were brought in violation of the Michigan state constitution. I don't want to get too in the weeds, but they used something called a one-man grand jury. That's basically a confidential process where all the evidence, all the witnesses, it's all behind closed doors. A judge is the one-man grand jury, so a judge weighs the evidence and issues indictments. The court threw out those cases because they said bringing this case through a one-man grand jury was against the Michigan Constitution, and as a result, she ended the investigation because most of these cases that she brought, the statute of limitations had already run up. The statute of limitations of Michigan's for most felonies is 6 years, and they had already passed. So here you have a attorney general who fired competent prosecutors and investigators, basically claiming they were incompetent, yet she sabotaged the investigation. And I believe, I can't get in her head. I don't know if it was intentional or just incompetence. Maybe it was both. But always follow the money. That's kind of how I view things. At the end of the day, the state of Michigan had a conflict in terms of prosecuting this because the state of Michigan, the Attorney General's office has to also defend Michigan. And the state of Michigan was on the hook for hundreds of millions of dollars in financial liability if the financial fraud that caused the Flint Water Crisis, if that went to criminal court. Because the Attorney General's office is the office that signed off on that fraudulent financial deal, the deal that allowed Flint to borrow $100 million to join this fraudulent pipeline. So because the state of Michigan signed off on it, you could have had bondholders suing the state. And I was told it could have bankrupted the state because the state cannot print money like the federal government. So the state of Michigan was facing hundreds of millions of dollars in liability. So that's a pretty good motivation to bury the financial case if it could bankrupt your state. And the second thing is the Wall Street banks, so J.P. Morgan and Wells Fargo, who issued the bonds for Flint to join the new water system, in the contract, they were supposed to do, they call it due diligence, to make sure that the Flint water plant could actually treat the water. Clearly, that was not done. The banks were actually sued civilly in 2020 on behalf of 2,500 Flint children. Of course, we live in America, so that case was thrown out because banks never really face much punishment. But the banks also, if that financial case, a racketeering case, if that goes forward in court, the banks could face hundreds of millions of dollars in liability. And obviously, politicians in both parties, we know, tend to protect banks.
Well, J.P. Morgan Chase was held accountable for enabling Jeffrey Epstein's Southern Trust down in the U.S. Virgin Islands with financial damages. So it can happen. It can happen.
Well, my point is, J.P. Morgan and Wells Fargo, they were not only facing financial liability; there could have been criminal liability.
But yeah, they should. And also, too, you would think, man, I had no idea that they were involved in this, too. The Epstein stuff's bad enough. J.P. Morgan Chase runs the EBT program. They get a cut of every food stamp transaction. Yep. You'd think they would lose that contract if they're doing shenanigans all over the joint, right?
Yeah. And by the way, a lot of your audience might not know this. These kinds of bond deals, they call them municipal bond deals. It's going on all over the country. Most cities on their own cannot afford, new water systems or whatever new projects. So they need to issue bonds, which is basically like IOUs. Jane and Joe citizen, you buy the bonds, you lend the government money, and the government will pay you back plus interest. But the unfortunate reality is the banks are making massive money on these bond deals, yet if you look at the fine print of these bond deals, a lot of these bond deals are, not exactly on the up and up. There's not meticulous safety practices going on, depending on what the deal is. So, you might not know in your community because, a lot of people don't go to their city council meetings or whatever. There's a lot of projects being funded by bond deals, and Wall Street is behind it. And you are, unfortunately, being screwed.
Yeah, I remember back in New York when I was growing up, with the Port Authority, there was a big scandal with raising money through bonds. I forget what it was, though. Once again, we're talking to Jordan Chariton. Okay, now you hear the guy's, the way he's telling this story, okay? Very well-told story. So he's written this book called We the Poisoned, Exposing the Flint Water Crisis Cover-Up and the Poisoning of 100,000 Americans. The link will be in the description. Now, it's important that we support reporters like this by buying their books, okay? This is what gets them on the show here, and this is what also gets them out there to do their work. Now, Mr. Chariton, on your website here, statuscoup.com, do you have a method for people to donate or perhaps a Patreon or something like that to support your work?
Yeah, thanks. This book, this reporting, we also have a documentary, by the way, that we released this year called Flint Fatigue. So you could check that out, flintfatigue.com. That shows that this is very much still a disaster. But this book would have never happened without, our viewers supporting us financially. We take no corporate money. All my reporting on the ground in Flint is funded by the people. So if you want to support that, you could chip in $5 a month at statuscoup.com/join.
Excellent. Statuscoup.com/join. Now, another thing that kind of came and went, I don't know if it's a little out there too much, but the woman, the scientist who discovered this chemical, the poisoned water, later on died.
Later on, who is that you're talking about?
The original woman who was the scientist who discovered the poison in the water died later on.
So the woman who really kind of blew this open, she was Dr. Mona Hanna-Attisha. She was a local pediatrician, and she was being told, I guess, by a friend of hers that was in the know that children, their blood lead levels were surging. So she got data from the health department showing that after the water switch, the spike was very obvious. Yeah. Blood lead levels were spiking up. Of course, the Snyder administration, the governor's administration at the time, tried to demonize her and make her sound crazy, but eventually they were forced to admit she was right. So she blew the whistle. She held a press conference revealing the data, saying that we should switch Flint back to Detroit's water system. She did not die; she's still alive. Okay. There was a plant worker, at the plant. His name was Matthew McFarland, and he was one of the plant workers. It's in my book. Who was sounding the alarm? Putting up the stop signs. We cannot switch to the Flint River. We're not ready. I mean, your audience might not know they were literally switching workers from the garbage department to the water department 2 weeks before the water switch. No disrespect to the garbage department, but they don't know anything about water. Mm-hmm. So that's how understaffed they were. But McFarland, he, under, it seems, mysterious circumstances, he died right after he testified. They claimed it was a drug overdose, but a lot of people in Flint have always suspected something else went on there.
Oh, boy. And you mentioned that there was some kind of a compensation, $170 million to build a new system, but the money was dispersed. There was problems where the money went.
Yep. Great American boondoggle, as always. Basically, Obama's Congress passed a bill for $170 million to go to Flint, but in the way our laws work, the money doesn't go straight to the city. It has to go through the state. So you're sending the money to the state that actively covered up the whole thing. And the cover-up, by the way, is a massive. I mean, it's all revealed in my book. We're talking political payoffs, destruction of evidence, witness tampering. I mean, this makes Watergate look like child's play. Nobody died from Watergate.
Yeah, I was just going to say, have you seen, in your experience, a bigger scandal than this?
No. I mean, I'm only 38, so some older viewers might tell me, listen, young buck, this is bad, but I don't know of a cover-up that involves the federal government, the state government, the local government. A private foundation was involved. I have a whole chapter on that. Wall Street banks, and that's killing people.
Yeah.
That's the difference between this and Watergate was just a bunch of knuckleheads who broke into an office. Somebody died. If Nixon wasn't involved, nobody would have cared. This is federal, state, local foundations, Wall Street, the media, by the way, is also in on it. And Flint right now has one of the worst cancer surges in America. Cancer is surging throughout Flint, and it is not from the weather, it's from the water. You have people who have died all over the city, and their deaths are not counted as due to the Flint Water Crisis, but they're dying of cancers at relatively young ages. Liver problems, kidney problems. That is a result of heavy metal poisoning. I've been there 21 times, and I have become friends with a lot of the residents. Every time I go back, somebody else I know has died. And we're not talking about, in your 80s. We're talking people in their 40s, people in their 50s, people in their 60s. I remember in 2018, I was doing a story there, and I was knocking on doors. I knocked on 400 doors because I found out that the governor's environmental department was manipulating the water testing. They were cheating on the water testing by running people's water right before they put the sample bottle under, which is illegal because you're just flushing out the lead. Every time, block after block, when people would open their door, I would say, hey, I've been knocking on doors here, and very few people are answering. Every block, every other block, they were telling me, oh, that person just died.
Oh, my God.
And we're not talking about necessarily elderly. We're talking just, people in their 40s who got cancers they never, they had no family history of. So, unfortunately, and this is not just Flint, we know about Love Canal and so many other areas that, people have died 5 years later, 10 years later, 20 years later, but there's not an alert on CNN, there's not like a live death count, but it's because of the water. So by the end of this, unfortunately, I think you could have thousands of people who have died from this, and that will not be reflected. The state of Michigan put out some nonsense number that 12 people died from this. That is a lie. And people are, it's not just the people that have died. You have to understand, if people are slowly dying, it's the living that are slowly dying, because the effects of heavy metal poisoning, it worsens every year that goes by because the lead goes deeper into your bones. So people get sicker and sicker and sicker. So I'm talking to residents, and every time I go back, a resident who might be in their 40s or 50s, I might see them, 1 year and then 2 years later, and it seems like they've aged by a decade. Through no fault of their own, but they've been poisoned. So, unfortunately, the way American media works is the media will cover something when there's an explosion or when there's the inciting incident, and then they'll move on. But, this is an unfolding disaster, and more importantly, 10 years later, the water is still not clean. There's no criminal justice. The pipes haven't been replaced. So that's why I stay on this. And I believe that this book is really important because, again, it might on the surface, it might seem like this is about one particular city. But I hope the book shows that this is bigger than water. This is about toxic government, which is not just in Flint, Michigan.
Yeah.
You cannot poison a whole community and then and then cover it up and then leave everyone to slowly die without toxic government. And that toxic government, that's all over the country. And it's not just Republicans. It's not just, it's not one party.
Yeah.
It's both parties.
Toxic capitalism is what the problem is, real quick, I might be conflating this, but was one of the solutions either in East Palestine or here in Flint was to provide the homeowners with little water filters?
Yeah, and that was some more government spin. Water filters are good, but, water filters, the kind of water filters they were passing around are not going to stop
lead.
Lead. They might put a dent in it, but those water filters were very flimsy. They went bad very quickly. They immediately went bad in hot water. And a problem with water filters is if you're handing out water filters, okay, maybe they put a dent in as far as lead. They don't remove lead completely, but those water filters breed bacteria. Okay. So you're kind of robbing Peter to pay Paul. You're maybe reducing lead a little bit, but you're creating bacteria. A bacteria is a big problem in the water in Flint because you have a water system that was built for a city when it had 200,000 residents. Right now it has 80,000 residents. So you have a water system that's too big for the current population. So many sections of Flint have abandoned homes where water is not being used. So water is then stagnant in the system. It's moving too slowly. So bottom line, they basically gave a Band-Aid for a gunshot wound. Really what you need, if you're not going to replace all of the pipes, which they should have, you need to install reverse osmosis systems or full home water filtrations in every home in Flint, which clearly they have not done.
We're out of time, my friend. I'm talking to Jordan Chariton, and you have an open invitation. Anything you ever want to come back and talk about, you have an open invitation to come back. I would love to have you back anytime. The book is called We the Poisoned, Exposing the Flint Water Crisis Cover-Up. Water Crisis Cover-Up and the Poisoning of 100,000 Americans. Now, you can find Jordan Chariton at statuscoup.com, and then you're going to go there, too, and help support him there, too, become like a member. His YouTube channel is called Status Coup. There's a film that's out called flintfatigue.com. Check that out. Follow him on Twitter, Status Coup. That's how you support these kind of people. Mr. Chariton, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me and covering this.
Yeah, I got Greg Palast coming on later on today, so that'll be another enjoyable. I'll hear about how democracy is shot to hell, too. What a day.
Yep.
But thank you so much, sir.
Thank you.
Good night.